When Beatrice Langford fired Caleb Archer in front of the board, she thought she had erased the one man standing between her and a $3 billion contract. He was just a single dad in oil-stained boots, a mechanic with no elite title, no polished resume, and no seat at the executive table. So she replaced him with 12 brilliant engineers and ordered them to restart Kestrel Six, the engine Caleb had spent 9 years building with his own hands. The screens lit up. The turbine groaned. Then everything died. One attempt failed. Then another. Then another. And as panic spread through the control room, Caleb was already walking home knowing exactly why his engine refused to wake up. At 4:47 in the morning, long before the executives of Langford Aerothermal Works had even lifted their heads from silk pillows, Caleb Archer was already inside Test Bay 6 with one palm pressed against the cold titanium skin of Kestrel 6, listening to the engine as if it were a sleeping animal that might bite if woken carelessly. The bay was nearly dark except for the blue emergency strips along the floor and the soft amber glow of the diagnostics wall where pressure curves, heat maps, and acoustic signatures floated in silence above the main console. Outside the reinforced glass, the industrial campus of Briarfield, Ohio, sat under a thin layer of frost, its chimneys breathing pale steam into the black morning sky. Inside, Caleb stood alone in worn work pants, a faded thermal shirt, and steel-toed boots with cracked leather around the toes, looking nothing like the man who had spent 9 years dragging the most important emergency turbine prototype in the Midwest from impossible theory into living machinery. He was 41, a single father, and the kind of man people underestimated until something expensive stopped working. His hands were scarred across the knuckles from heat shields, stripped bolts, and years of reaching into places where no design team had expected human skin to go. He kept his hair cut short, because loose hair near a spinning turbine was foolish, packed the same plain lunch every day because school fees came before restaurants, and left the facility every evening at 6, unless the engine was in real danger because his daughter Sophie had learned too early what an empty dinner chair felt like. To Beatrice Langford, the woman whose name stood in steel letters over the main entrance, Caleb was an inconvenience wrapped in company overalls. To the crews who actually worked the floor, he was the reason Kestrel 6 had not destroyed itself 3 times in the past 2 years. The engine itself was the prize everyone wanted, but almost no one understood a hybrid turbine system designed to power hospitals, water stations, emergency shelters, and command centers through a regional grid collapse without external resupply for days. The Northern Municipal Energy Board had spent 18 months negotiating a $3 billion deployment contract, and the final demonstration was scheduled for the next morning. If Kestrel 6 reached full operational load under verification conditions, Langford Aerothermal Works would become the dominant name in emergency infrastructure for the next decade. If it failed, the board would walk, investors would scatter, and Beatrice Langford's carefully polished image as the visionary CEO who had brought the future of crisis energy online would crack in front of the only audience she truly feared. That was why Caleb had come before dawn. Not to impress anyone, not to make a speech, not to protect a title. He came because the engine had sounded wrong the night before. Not broken, not failing, not loudly enough for any standard checklist to catch, but wrong in the way a father hears one uneven breath from a sleeping child and knows something is off before the thermometer confirms it. He powered up the passive acoustic array, ran a low-load circulation cycle, and waited with his eyes on the vibration trace. For 12 minutes, the line behaved. Then, just as the 4th compression chamber crossed its early thermal threshold, a faint tremor appeared in the frequency band Caleb had spent years teaching the monitoring system to recognize. It was small enough to be dismissed as environmental noise. It was rhythmic enough to make his jaw tighten. He leaned closer, adjusted the gain, and watched the tremor repeat. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it vanished, leaving the screen smooth and innocent. Caleb did not move for a long moment. He had seen that pattern before, not exactly the same, but close enough to bring back the memory of a night 4 winters earlier when Kestrel Six had nearly torn its pressure housing apart because a thermal memory loop accepted a false baseline and began correcting toward a lie. Back then, Caleb had been alone in this same bay with 2 technicians, a failing coolant pump, and Sophie asleep on a video call beside his toolbox, because there had been no one to pick her up from school. He had saved the engine then by discovering that a small silver locking ring beside the pressure balance valve needed to remain 3 degrees off the factory diagram, not because the diagram was careless, but because the real engine had developed a resonance no original model had predicted. That offset had become part of Kestrel Six's survival language. Anyone who saw it without knowing the story would think it was wrong. Anyone who corrected it would teach the engine the wrong truth. Caleb pulled his notebook from the cabinet under the console and wrote the time chamber temperature compressor tone, air density, and tremor pattern in neat block letters. Then he cross-checked 6 weeks of sensor history and found the drift hiding beneath normal readings like a hairline crack under fresh paint. By 5:36, he had drafted the report. By 5:51, he had attached the relevant graphs, the prior case comparison, and the recovery risk note. By 5:58, he had sent it to Beatrice Langford, the board's technical liaison operations management and safety assurance. The subject line was simple because he knew simple was harder to pretend not to understand. Do not restart before recalibration is complete. He recommended a 72-hour delay, a full thermal resynchronization, and a physical inspection of the silver locking ring before any public load demonstration. Then he sat back, rubbed both hands over his face, and stared at the engine. "You picked a hell of a morning to whisper," he muttered. Kestrel Six answered with silence. 40 floors above the bay, Beatrice Langford read Caleb's report in a glass-walled office where the carpet was soft enough to swallow footsteps, and the city skyline looked distant and obedient. She was 52, white, elegant, precise, and famous in interviews for saying that hesitation killed innovation. She had inherited part of the company, expanded most of it, and learned early that people confused confidence with competence if the lighting was good and the numbers were large. Caleb's report arrived while she was reviewing the seating chart for the Northern Municipal Energy Board demonstration. She opened it, skimmed the first page, paused at the recommendation to delay, and felt a cold irritation settle behind her eyes. 3 days, 72 hours. After 18 months of negotiations, political dinners, late investor calls, and press strategy. After promising the board that Langford-era Thermal Works had matured beyond its dependence on what one consultant had once called floor knowledge. After privately assuring directors that Kestrel Six was no longer trapped inside the head of a mechanic with too much informal authority. Beatrice scrolled through the graphs without truly reading them. To her, Caleb's language had always sounded like a lock with no key. Acoustic drift, thermal memory pressure, compensation, behavioral signature. Every warning seemed to end with the same conclusion that no one should touch the engine until Caleb said it was ready. Maybe he believed it. Maybe he had even earned the belief. But Beatrice had spent the past 2 weeks preparing to remove him precisely because belief had become power, and she did not tolerate power that did not answer upward. At 6:12, she marked the report low priority. At 6:15, she forwarded nothing to the client. At 6:20, she called her chief of staff and confirmed that the 12 external engineers had arrived in the company guest wing overnight. By 7 o'clock, their temporary access badges were active. By 8:30, the board received a meeting invitation labeled Strategic Demonstration Readiness Review. Caleb did not see any of that. He spent the morning exactly where he always spent mornings when the engine was uneasy on the floor, moving between the compressor housing and the valve bank, reading numbers, touching metal, listening between pulses of machinery. When his phone buzzed with the meeting request, he frowned at the time because it cut directly through the calibration window he had reserved for the 4th chamber. No agenda, no notes, just his name, Beatrice's name, several board members, and a conference room on the 38th floor. He looked up through the glass toward the high offices and felt for the first time that morning a human warning beneath the mechanical one. Hannah Pierce. The safety assurance lead found him beside the valve assembly 20 minutes later. Hannah was white 36, sharp-eyed, and known for writing reports no executive enjoyed receiving. She glanced at the tablet in Caleb's hand and then at the engine. "You sent the delay recommendation," she asked. Caleb nodded. "And nothing." Hannah's mouth tightened. "That is not nothing. That is a decision pretending to be silence." Caleb looked back at the silver locking ring, its small, brushed surface catching the work lights. "If anyone touches this before the thermal loop is cleared, the engine will remember the wrong pressure cycle." Hannah followed his gaze. "Then put that in writing again." "Already did." "Then say it out loud upstairs." Caleb gave a tired half smile. "You think they invited me upstairs to listen?" Hannah did not answer, which was answer enough. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Caleb stepped out of the freight elevator on the 38th floor with a paper copy of his report tucked under one arm and grease still dark beneath one thumbnail. The conference room had glass on 3 sides and a direct view down into Test Bay 6, where Kestrel 6 rested below like a captured storm. Around the long table sat Beatrice, 4 board members, legal counsel, 2 operations directors, and 12 strangers whose suits were too new to belong to the floor. Caleb recognized some of their names from trade journals and technical conferences. Dr. Graham Weller sat nearest the screen, white-haired at the temples, calm, attentive, and quietly uncomfortable, in the way competent people become uncomfortable when they sense they have been brought into a room for a performance rather than a discussion. Behind him, the presentation slide displayed the combined credentials of the new team: aerospace propulsion thermal systems, military turbine recovery failure modeling, grid-scale power deployment. Beatrice let Caleb see the slide before she spoke. That was intentional. Everything in the room was intentional. "Mr. Archer," she began using the formal tone she saved for public correction. "This company has reached a stage where Kestrel 6 can no longer be managed as a personal workshop project." Caleb remained standing. No one had offered him a chair. "Kestrel 6 is not ready for tomorrow's restart," he said. "The 4th chamber is showing early drift under thermal load. I sent the data this morning." Beatrice smiled without warmth. "Yes, another warning. Another delay. Another specialized explanation that conveniently requires your sole interpretation." The room went still. Caleb felt several eyes move from Beatrice to him, then away. Beatrice continued smoother now, as if delivering a line she had rehearsed until it stopped sounding cruel to her own ears. "For years, this company has allowed an unhealthy dependency to grow around one employee's undocumented habits. You have done meaningful work here, Caleb. No one denies that. But meaningful work does not entitle anyone to hold a $3 billion program hostage behind private notes, improvised adjustments, and personal mystique." Caleb stared at her. "Private notes. You mean the recovery annexes? I mean obstruction disguised as expertise." She gestured toward Graham and the engineers. "Effective immediately, Dr. Weller and his team will assume operational control of Kestrel 6. You will surrender your access credentials pending review of all project documentation." For 1 second, Caleb heard nothing. Not the ventilation, not the faint hum of the screens, not even his own breath. He thought of Sophie's science fair model on the kitchen table, the one she had made out of cardboard tubes because she wanted to build a tiny version of Dad's engine. He thought of 9 years of burned weekends, missed sleep, and standing in that bay with a legal pad while executives who could not identify a pressure manifold called his work company property. He placed his report on the table and slid it toward Graham instead of Beatrice. "Before you restart," Caleb said, "you need the K6R thermal resynchronization appendix. It explains the silver locking ring offset and the deep lock recovery sequence." Graham looked at the folder, then at Beatrice. "That appendix was not in the handover package we received." Caleb's eyes did not leave Beatrice. There it was. Not incompetence. Not oversight. A missing bridge removed before anyone else knew they needed to cross it. Beatrice's expression hardened. The handover package contains all necessary engineering documentation. No, Caleb said quietly. It contains what you wanted them to see. One of the board members shifted. Legal counsel lowered his pen. Beatrice rose from her chair. That is enough. Caleb turned to Graham because Graham at least looked like a man who might understand the weight of a fact. Do not rotate the silver ring beside the pressure balance valve. It sits off the diagram for a reason. If it is corrected before the thermal memory is cleared, the engine will build its next restart around a false baseline. After that, every failed attempt will make the lock harder to unwind. Beatrice gave a short laugh. You see, this is exactly the problem. A hidden rule, a secret ring, a warning only you can interpret. It is not secret if you stop deleting the documents that explain it. The sentence landed like a dropped tool on concrete. Beatrice's face changed, not dramatically, but enough for Caleb to know he had struck the truth. She looked toward the security officer waiting near the door, a man Caleb had seen every Christmas handing out candy canes in the lobby. Escort. Mr. Archer out, she said. Collect his badge, workstation card, and cabinet key. The guard hesitated for half a heartbeat, then stepped forward. Caleb looked down through the glass at Kestrel 6. The engine sat under its lights, massive and silent, unaware of the human arrogance gathering above it. He could fight. He could raise his voice. He could refuse to hand over the badge and give Beatrice the scene she needed to turn him from inconvenient expert into unstable former employee. Or he could leave with the truth intact and let the machine answer in the only language these people would be unable to spin. Slowly, Caleb unclipped his badge, placed it on the table, added his access card and the small brass key to the gray cabinet beside his workbench. No speech, no begging, no apology. As the guard led him out, Graham's eyes followed him with the troubled focus of a man beginning to realize he had inherited more than a machine. At the elevator, Caleb paused beside the window overlooking the bay one last time. His voice was low, meant for no one and everyone. An engine does not restart because the loudest person in the building orders it to. It restarts for the people who understand what it needs. Then the elevator doors closed, carrying him down and away from the engine he had built, while 12 elite engineers prepared to wake a machine that had just lost the only man who knew why it was afraid to open its eyes. By the time the elevator carried Caleb Archer down from the 38th floor to the lobby, the news had already outrun him. In a building like Langford Aerothermal Works, official announcements moved through email, but humiliation moved faster through silence, through turned heads, through the sudden lowering of voices, when a man in work boots walked past, carrying nothing but the weight of 9 stolen years. The security guard beside him kept his eyes on the elevator doors, not because Caleb had done anything to frighten him, but because shame sometimes belonged to the person obeying the order, not the person suffering it. When the doors opened, Caleb stepped into the marble lobby beneath the silver company emblem and felt the cold afternoon air waiting beyond the glass. He did not look back at the reception desk, did not argue with the guard, did not ask to retrieve the lunch still sitting in the break room refrigerator or the spare jacket hanging on the peg beside his workstation. He signed the visitor removal form because legal required a signature for everything except decency, then walked out into the parking lot where frost still clung to the shadows under the cars. Behind him, 40 stories of steel and glass carried on, as if the most important thing in the building had not just been escorted outside. Above the lobby in Test Bay 6, Dr. Graham Weller stood with 11 elite engineers around Kestrel 6 and began the process. Beatrice Langford had promised would be simple. Graham was not an arrogant man. He had spent 30 years around machines powerful enough to punish pride, and he knew better than to confuse a resume with understanding. Still, the handover package looked complete at first glance. Thousands of pages of assembly drawings, control diagrams, material specifications, system maps, component histories, and performance targets. Beatrice had provided a clean conference table, a full digital archive access to the bay, and a deadline that left no room for discomfort. "We will divide the architecture by function," Graham said, keeping his voice steady for the younger engineers who were watching him. "Compressor group, thermal group, valve, and pressure group, electrical and software group. No assumptions that are not verified twice. No adjustments unless logged." It was the correct approach for an unfamiliar turbine. It was also, though none of them knew it yet, not enough. Kestrel 6 did not behave like a machine assembled from isolated systems. It behaved like a memory with metal around it. Every correction in one subsystem moved through the others with consequences that appeared minutes later in places the diagrams treated as unrelated. The compressor did not simply compress. It fed pressure behavior into thermal prediction. The thermal system did not merely cool. It taught the control software what kind of vibration was acceptable. The acoustic sensors did not simply listen. They moderated when the engine trusted its own pressure readings. By late afternoon, the engineers had discovered that the documentation described the skeleton of the engine, but not its habits. Peter Alden, a white systems engineer from a defense contractor in Virginia, was assigned to the pressure balance valve assembly. He was careful, experienced, and exactly the kind of person Beatrice believed proved Caleb replaceable. He found the small silver locking ring behind a removable inspection shield and frowned. The ring sat 3 degrees off the factory alignment mark, just as Caleb had warned. A pencil mark beside it pointed to the offset, but the mark was old and informal, not printed in any official diagram. Peter pulled up the latest assembly schematic on his tablet. The schematic showed the ring centered. He checked 2 more documents. Both showed the same. He searched the digital archive for silver ring offset pressure balance deviation and K6R. Nothing. He hesitated, because good engineers do hesitate when reality and documentation disagree, but the whole day had been framed around the idea that Caleb had buried the engine beneath private rituals. The offset looked like one of those rituals. "I have a non-standard ring position on valve bank 4, Peter called. Graham crossed the bay and studied it. "Is it logged?" "Not in the package. Any damage, no. It looks intentional, but I cannot find authorization." Graham looked up through the glass toward the conference level where Beatrice was watching with several board members. He could feel the pressure of the deadline as a physical thing. "Return it to documented alignment," he said at last. Slowly, log the original position first. Peter recorded the offset, then turned the ring 3 degrees clockwise. The movement was tiny, almost laughably small, less than the width of a fingernail along the ring's edge. Nothing sparked. No alarm sounded. No red warning filled the screens. Kestrel 6 simply accepted the change into itself with the quiet obedience of a system that had not yet decided whether the person touching it understood what he had done. 15 minutes later, Hannah Pierce saw the first sign of trouble. She was seated at the safety station reviewing pre-start diagnostics with the grim patience of someone who had been ignored often enough to stop expecting wisdom from titles. A sensor synchronization trace slipped half a beat out of alignment, then returned. She marked it, replayed it, and felt her stomach tighten. "Hold pre-start," she said. "I have pressure thermal desynchronization across the 4th chamber loop." Beatrice, who had come down to the bay to be seen supervising progress, turned sharply. "Is the engine damaged?" "I do not know yet." "Then do not dramatize a trace fluctuation." Hannah looked at her. A trace fluctuation is exactly how large failures introduce themselves politely. Several engineers heard that and looked away, not because it was wrong, but because it was too correct for the room's politics. Graham requested 30 additional minutes to investigate. Beatrice granted 10, then spent those 10 standing near the main console in a white suit that had no business in an engine bay asking questions that were not designed to uncover truth, but to show the board she was in command. At 5:40, with the Northern Municipal Energy Board demonstration less than 24 hours away, Beatrice ordered the first restart attempt. Graham objected mildly, then more firmly stating that the diagnostic irregularity deserved root cause analysis. Beatrice reminded him of the contract, the credentials of his team, and the commitment she had made in front of the board. "We did not bring you here to admire uncertainty, Dr. Weller," she said. "We brought you here to move past it." Graham's jaw tightened, but he gave the start sequence order because the readings, while concerning, remained within the outer tolerance band. Auxiliary power engaged cleanly. Lights moved across the control wall in neat green progression. The primary compressor began to rotate. For 3 seconds, the bay filled with the low, magnificent growl of a giant waking under restraint. Then Kestrel 6 stopped. Not with an explosion, not with a metallic scream. It stopped with something worse, deliberate silence. The control wall flashed amber, then red. A diagnostic code appeared that none of the engineers recognized TML9 false reference hold. Peter searched the official manual. Nothing. Graham searched the handover archive. Nothing. Another engineer tried the internal code library. Nothing. Beatrice stared at the red screen as if offended by its existence. "What does that mean?" she demanded. Graham did not answer immediately because professional honesty required a pause. "It appears to be a thermal memory lock." "Appears. The code is not in the documentation we were given." The room changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way rooms change when people begin to understand that the missing piece may have been removed by someone standing close enough to hear them breathe. Beatrice recovered first, then clear it. For the next 6 hours, 12 elite engineers tried. They restored the engine control software from a clean backup. Kestrel 6 woke for 4 seconds and died. They replaced 2 pressure sensors matched by serial calibration. It woke for 3 seconds and died. They recalibrated fuel timing, checked the electrical buses, reloaded the control image, isolated the thermal prediction model, and rebuilt the startup sequence from factory specification. Each attempt produced the same brief promise followed by the same controlled refusal. By the 5th failure, the bay no longer felt like a place of expertise. It felt like a courtroom where the witness would only repeat one answer. At 9:18 that night, Graham called for a complete halt. "No more starts until we understand the lock." Beatrice, who had been answering investor texts with increasingly stiff fingers, looked at him as if he had betrayed her personally. "The demonstration is in the morning. Then the demonstration should be delayed." The word delayed struck her harder from Graham than it had from Caleb, because Graham was supposed to be the cure for Caleb. "No," she said. "You will write a manual override." Graham slowly removed his glasses. A manual override of a multi-layer safety lock on a prototype turbine under uncertain thermal memory conditions would be reckless. It would be decisive. It would be unsafe. It would save this contract. It could destroy the engine. Beatrice stepped closer, lowering her voice, but not enough that Hannah could not hear. "What exactly am I paying 12 elite engineers for if all of you are afraid of a locked screen?" Graham's face remained calm, but something in his eyes cooled. "You are paying us not to turn a recoverable fault into a catastrophic one." That was the moment Beatrice changed the story. The failure could not be caused by the engine because that would mean Caleb had been right. It could not be caused by missing documentation because that would point back to her office. It could not be caused by her deadline because she did not believe deadlines were capable of guilt. So it became sabotage. By midnight, an internal memo moved through Langford Aerothermal Works stating that a recently separated employee may have embedded hidden dependencies and unauthorized lock conditions into the Kestrel 6 control architecture. It did not name Caleb Archer, but it did not have to. His accounts were frozen, his workstation was sealed, and his gray cabinet beside the bay was emptied by legal staff who carried his notebooks away in evidence bags as if handwriting were contraband. At home, 40 minutes from Briarfield's industrial campus, Caleb sat at a small kitchen table while Sophie pushed peas around her plate and pretended not to notice the company badge lying face down on the counter. "Are you fired?" she asked at last. Caleb looked at his daughter, at the freckles across her nose, at the brave steadiness she had inherited from losing her mother too young and watching her father come home tired too often. Yes, he said, because he had never believed in lying gently when the truth could be held carefully. Sophie swallowed. Because of the engine. Because some people think owning a thing is the same as understanding it. She considered that with 11-year-old seriousness. Can they fix it without you? Caleb's eyes moved toward the dark window where his reflection looked older than it had that morning. They are smart people, he said. That is not what I asked. He almost smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. No, not if they touch the ring first. Across the city, the 9th restart attempt failed at 1:07 a.m. The same red code appeared. The same silence followed. Graham stood beside the pressure balance valve and stared at the silver ring now sitting neatly on the factory mark. Caleb's warning returned to him word for word, no longer sounding possessive or mystical, only specific. Do not rotate the silver ring. By 2:30, Graham was reading backward through archived communications, searching not for proof of sabotage but for context. What he found made him sit very still. 7 reports from Caleb over 2 years described thermal memory lock behavior, false pressure baselines, and a recovery procedure stored in something called Appendix K-6R. Each report had been routed through Beatrice's office. Each had been marked no action required. At 3:05, a junior engineer found the server record. Appendix K-6R had been removed from the handover archive 6 weeks earlier by an administrative command authorized under Beatrice Langford's executive credentials. The reason entered was presentation simplification. Graham took the findings to Beatrice before dawn. She was in the observation room, pale with sleeplessness and anger, staring down at the dead engine. He laid the server log and Caleb's reports on the table. This team was not given the recovery procedure, he said. The document was removed. Beatrice did not deny it. That more than anything told him how bad it was. It was clutter, she said. Personalized floor mythology dressed as engineering. It contains the procedure we need. Then recreate it. Not overnight, not from incomplete data, not after 9 failed starts have reinforced the false baseline. Beatrice's voice sharpened. You sound like him. Graham looked through the glass at Kestrel Six. Then maybe he was telling you the truth. At 7:40 that morning, Diane Mercer arrived from the Northern Municipal Energy Board with 3 independent verifiers and no patience for corporate theater. Diane was white 48, composed and experienced enough in infrastructure procurement to know when a demonstration smelled managed instead of ready. She asked for the operational log before accepting coffee. By the time she finished reading the record of 9 failed restart attempts, her expression had become dangerously blank. Explain why this engine has entered repeated thermal memory lock less than 12 hours before a contracted verification test, she said. Beatrice delivered the sabotage narrative with impressive polish. A disgruntled former employee, unauthorized dependencies, ongoing legal review, near resolution. Diane listened, then asked for evidence. Beatrice said the investigation was developing. Diane closed the folder. That is not evidence. That is vocabulary. Graham spoke before Beatrice could recover. There is no evidence Caleb Archer sabotaged this engine. The available record shows the pressure balance ring was rotated after his departure by this team under incomplete documentation. The recovery appendix was removed from the handover archive by executive authorization. The engine is responding to that chain of events. The observation room went silent. Beatrice turned on him with a look so cold it seemed to drain the color from the glass. Dr. Weller, your services are terminated. Graham nodded once as if she had confirmed something already obvious. That does not change the engine. Beatrice pointed to the youngest engineer at the console, a nervous man named Owen Clark. Begin manual bypass. Owen stared at her, then at Graham, then down through the glass at Kestrel Six. "No. Excuse me. I will not bypass a safety lock I do not understand." Beatrice looked around the room for obedience and found none. One by one, the engineers refused. Hannah opened her logbook and wrote every word. Diane informed the board that Northern Municipal Energy would suspend the contract unless the engine reached verified stable load by midday the next day. Beatrice stood surrounded by 12 elite engineers, a dead engine, and the ruins of her own certainty. And somewhere across Briarfield, Caleb Archer was packing Sophie's school lunch, still unemployed, still accused, and still the only man who knew how to make Kestrel Six breathe again. At 8:12 that morning, while Caleb Archer was rinsing Sophie's cereal bowl in the kitchen sink and trying to decide whether unemployment should feel heavier than it did, his phone began to ring from the counter where he had left it face down beside the dead company badge. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Sophie, already wearing her backpack, looked from the phone to her father with the sharp, careful attention of a child who had learned that adults often pretended not to be afraid. "Are you going to answer?" she asked. Caleb dried his hands on a dish towel and turned the phone over. Margaret Voss. He knew the name, though he had only spoken to her twice in 9 years. Chairwoman of the board. The kind of woman who appeared at ceremonies, shook hands for photographs, and left before the actual machines were started. Caleb answered without saying hello. "If this is about the accusation, I want everything in writing." There was a pause on the other end, not offended, not surprised. "Mr. Archer, Margaret said the board has opened an emergency review. We have the server log. We have Dr. Weller's statement. We have Ms. Pierce's safety notes. And we have the original Kestrel commercialization agreement." Caleb looked out the kitchen window at the thin winter light lying across the backyard. That last sentence mattered more than all the others. "Then you know Beatrice terminated the technical oversight condition." "Yes. And you know what that means. It means Langford Aerothermal Works may not currently possess lawful authority to demonstrate, license, or deploy Kestrel Six without your reinstated oversight." Caleb closed his eyes for 1 second. He had never wanted the agreement to become a weapon. He had insisted on that clause years ago because he had seen what executives did to machines when deadlines stood too close to money. "What do you want?" he asked. Margaret's voice lost a degree of formality. "We need you back in the bay." Sophie's face changed at once. She had heard enough to understand the shape of the call, if not the details. Caleb held her gaze and said into the phone, "You do not need me back. You need Kestrel Six restarted before Diane Mercer voids the contract. Both are true. Then hear me carefully. I am not returning as a temporary mechanic, so Beatrice can survive the morning and rewrite the story by afternoon. Name your terms." Caleb looked at the company badge lying on the counter like a small silver insult. He thought of the room where Beatrice had taken his work, his name, his access, and almost his reputation with one polished sentence. Then he thought of Graham Weller, a good engineer placed inside a rigged failure. He thought of Hannah Pierce, whose warnings had been treated like decoration until the machinery proved her right. He thought of every technician whose initials lived in his notebooks, but never appeared in corporate presentations. First, Caleb said, "The sabotage allegation is retracted in writing and read aloud before the board, the engineering team, safety assurance, and Northern Municipal Energy. It names me. It states there was no evidence. It stays in the record." Margaret did not interrupt. "Second, all operational safety authority for Kestrel Six moves to technical leadership and safety assurance. No executive override, no quiet bypass orders, no presentation schedule outranking physical reality." Understood. Third, every contribution record, every patent appendix, every design credit, every development file gets corrected. Not just mine. Everyone who built that engine gets named where they belong. Margaret was silent long enough for Caleb to hear Sophie's school bus braking at the corner. "Those terms are acceptable," she said. "They will be signed before you enter the bay." Caleb hung up. walked Sophie to the door and knelt to zip the coat she always forgot to close. "Are you going to fix it?" she asked. Caleb looked past her toward the road, toward the city, toward the engine, waiting in silence. "No," he said. "I'm going to help them understand it." 47 minutes later, Caleb Archer walked back through the main entrance of Langford Aerothermal Works in the same worn boots, the same work pants, and the same faded jacket he had been wearing when security let him out. This time, no guard touched his arm. No receptionist asked for a visitor sticker. People in the lobby looked up from their desks, some quickly, some openly, and the silence that followed him was different from yesterday's silence. Yesterday, it had been the silence of a man being removed. Today, it was the silence of a building realizing it had removed the wrong man. Margaret Voss met him outside the 38th floor conference room with a signed folder in her hand. She was a white woman in her early 60s, silver-haired, controlled, and visibly tired in the way powerful people looked when consequences had finally reached their own floor. "Your terms are executed," she said. Caleb opened the folder, read every page, then nodded once. Inside the conference room, Beatrice Langford stood at the head of the table with the expression of someone swallowing glass without permission to bleed. Graham Weller was present, reinstated by board order. Hannah Pierce sat with her logbook open. Diane Mercer and her verification team stood near the windows. The 12 engineers occupied one side of the table, none of them looking triumphant because no one competent enjoys being used as a weapon and then blamed for failing to fire properly. Margaret placed a printed statement in front of Beatrice. "Read it," she said. Beatrice's eyes flicked toward Caleb. For the first time since he had known her, she looked smaller than the title beside her name. Yesterday, Beatrice began, her voice tight but audible. "I authorized internal communications, suggesting that Caleb Archer may have interfered with or sabotaged the Kestrel Six system. That allegation had no evidentiary basis. Subsequent review confirms that Mr. Archer submitted a timely safety warning that the required K6R appendix was removed from the handover archive by executive authorization and that the failed restart attempts occurred after his departure. The record is corrected accordingly." No one applauded. Applause would have cheapened it. Caleb did not look satisfied. He simply turned and walked out because the engine was still downstairs, and apologies did not restart machines. In Test Bay, 6 Kestrel 6 stood under hard white lights with 9 failed attempts stored inside it like bruises. Caleb stopped 10 feet from the main console and listened. Not to the people. To the machine. The bay felt crowded, but he treated the crowd as weather. "Nobody touches controls until I know exactly what happened," he said. Graham stepped beside him carrying a tablet. "I have the sequence log. I do not want the log first. I want the people." One by one, the engineers described what they had done. Peter Alden spoke about the silver ring without defending himself. "I rotated it to documented alignment." Caleb nodded. "Because the document told you it was wrong." "Yes." "Then the document failed you before you touched the part." That sentence loosened something in the room. Peter had been waiting for blame. Caleb gave him causality. Hannah read the safety desynchronization she had recorded before the first start. Graham explained each recovery attempt, the sensor swaps, the software, restore the fuel timing adjustment, the control image reload, the repeated lock. Caleb listened without interruption, building the sequence in his head as if reconstructing a collapsed bridge from the pattern of dust beneath it. When they finished, he walked to the pressure balance valve and looked at the silver ring sitting perfectly on the factory mark. "The ring is not the real problem anymore," he said. Beatrice, watching from the observation level above, despite the suspension of her operational authority, leaned toward the intercom. Then what is Caleb did not look up. The engine learned a lie. He moved to the main display and pulled up the thermal memory record. When the ring was rotated, Kestrel 6 accepted a false pressure cycle as its reference. Every restart since then reinforced that false baseline. If we simply put the ring back, the system will compare the corrected physical state against the wrong memory and lock again. We have to clear the memory without making the engine think we are attacking it. Graham's eyes sharpened. Appendix K-6R. Caleb removed a small encrypted drive from his jacket pocket. The original. Written before Langford ever owned deployment rights. He inserted it into the workstation. Files opened across the monitors. Years of acoustic readings, temperature curves, pressure, offsets, failure notes, counterexamples, hand-marked recovery sequences, every ugly lesson Kestrel Six had taught him before it became beautiful enough for executives to sell. The room leaned toward the screens, not because the data was magical, but because it was complete. Caleb divided the team without drama. Graham would handle the valve timing. Peter would monitor the ring position and pressure offset because Caleb believed people learned best by repairing the consequence of their own honest mistake. 2 engineers would run acoustic comparison. Hannah would own the safety board and could stop the process with one word. And me. Beatrice's voice came through the intercom again, brittle and angry. Margaret answered from above before Caleb could. You will observe silently until the board completes its review. Caleb began the recovery at 10:43. Auxiliary power came first, low and clean. Then the compressor entered slow rotation, not enough to start, just enough to let the sensors remember motion without fear. The thermal memory flush began in stages, each one paired with a real-time acoustic reading. Caleb stood at the console with his head slightly tilted, listening to the tone beneath the tone, the faint unevenness no microphone had ever made him stop trusting his own ears. Valve 2 half-degree open, he said. Graham adjusted. Hold. Peter, ring back 1 degree, not 3. Peter moved carefully. The red warning appeared at once. Beatrice's voice broke through the intercom, almost triumphant. The failure is repeating. Hannah's hand moved over the stop control. Caleb raised 2 fingers but did not take his eyes off the display. Wait for acoustic confirmation. The vibration trace caught up half a second later. The red shifted to amber. Hannah exhaled. The compressor kept turning. Now another degree, Caleb said. Peter adjusted. The temperature curve trembled, then steadied. Thermal flush stage 2. Graham entered the command from K6R. The engine resisted with a low groan that moved through the floor and into the bones of everyone present. Caleb closed his eyes. There you are, he whispered. Then a maintenance technician near the auxiliary load panel froze one hand on his headset. Hannah saw it. Who is talking to you? She asked. The technician swallowed. Executive observation line. I was told to increase load manually to improve the curve before verification capture. The bay went cold. Caleb looked up at the glass. Beatrice stood behind it, white-faced. Hannah wrote the instruction in her logbook, time-stamped it, and passed it to Margaret's representative. Margaret's voice came over the intercom, steady as a door locking. Beatrice Langford's executive authority is suspended pending formal removal review. Security escort her from the observation room. Beatrice stepped back as if the building itself had betrayed her. No one in the bay moved until she was gone. Caleb returned his eyes to the console. Continue. The final stage was the most delicate. The ring had to return to its true offset, while the thermal memory accepted live pressure data as the new baseline. Too fast and the system would lock. Too slow and the false reference would remain. On my count, Caleb said. 3, 2, 1. Graham opened the valve sequence. Peter eased the silver ring into its old, wrong-looking correct position. Hannah watched the safety numbers climb to the edge of shutdown. The acoustic trace wavered. For one terrible second, Kestrel Six seemed ready to die again. Then the false baseline cleared. The amber lights turned green one by one. The compressor passed the rotational band that had killed every previous attempt. 30% load, 45, 60. The ceramic core temperature stabilized. 80, 90, 100. Kestrel Six reached full operational load and held there, not roaring, Not showing off, simply running with the deep, steady confidence of a thing finally given what it needed. No one cheered at first. The sound was too large for cheering. Diane Mercer's verification team confirmed the readings. Graham crossed the bay and offered Caleb his hand. "We came here to replace you," he said quietly. Caleb shook his hand. "No. You were brought here to replace a story someone told about me. That is not the same thing. The investigation lasted 13 days. It confirmed that Beatrice had removed K6R, suppressed Caleb's warnings, misled the board, invented the sabotage narrative, and attempted to influence a live verification test after losing authority. She was removed as CEO without ceremony. Her portrait disappeared from the lobby wall before the week ended. Margaret offered Caleb the chief executive role, but he refused before she finished the sentence. "The company already tried putting the wrong kind of person in the wrong chair," he said. "Do not fix that by doing it again." Instead, he accepted the title of Chief Systems Architect for the Kestrel program, with independent authority over safety-critical operations and a written guarantee that no executive could override technical shutdown criteria. Graham and the 11 engineers stayed not as replacements, but as the first cohort of the Kestrel Technical Division. Hannah Pierce became Director of Operational Safety, with unilateral stop authority. Peter Alden became the engineer most obsessive about documenting non-standard physical corrections, which Caleb considered an excellent outcome. At the contract signing, Diane Mercer asked Caleb to stand at the center of the photograph. He did, but only after pulling Graham to one side and Hannah to the other. Kestrel Six was never one man's engine, Caleb said when a reporter asked for a quote. It just needed people willing to listen before ordering it to obey. That evening, he left at 6. The bay was still lit behind him. Kestrel 6 running under monitored load, the silver ring sitting 3 degrees off the diagram exactly where it belonged. Caleb drove home through the winter dusk, set his phone face down on the kitchen counter, and sat across from Sophie while she told him about a spelling test, a cafeteria argument, and a cardboard engine model that had survived the bus ride. For the first time in days, he laughed without effort. Across Briarfield, the machine people had called his secret kept running in plain sight, no longer protected by silence, but by truth, written clearly enough that no one could erase it without leaving fingerprints.